Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar on how to improve your contractor qualification program. BROWZ provides supplier and contractor qualification and management solutions. Our mission is to give you visibility into your supply chain and ensure that you're working with safe, qualified and socially responsible contractors. We've helped companies for over 15 years and we've learned a lot during that time. And that's what we want to share with you today. My name is Tino and I'll be your host today. Before we begin, I want to cover a few logistics. As a reminder, you're in listen-only mode. This presentation will last about 45 minutes and we will have a time for questions at the end of this presentation. I encourage you to log in through your computer and make sure that you can send in any questions. There's a Q&A question button at the right-hand corner on the top of your screen that you can select to send any questions anytime during this presentation. As I mentioned, my name is Tino BROWZ. I've gained over 20 years experience in multiple disciplines within the mining and telecommunications sectors within Australia, Africa and Asia. Over my career, I've held various management roles in operations, product management, project management and supply chain related functions. I've joined BROWZ in 2013 as the first employee in Australia, and today I'm looking after the Australian operations. Also, in terms of our presenters today, I've also been joined by Doug Hall and Owen West. Doug brings over 20 years of sales and sales management experience to BROWZ. As Director of Business Development of the BROWZ Australia APAC region, Doug is responsible for all aspects of obtaining new business in Australia. In the APAC region, Doug is proud to lead this team in Australia, which consists of himself and some team members. He enjoys building long-term client relationships built on foundation of customer service and responsiveness. Prior to joining BROWZ, Doug worked as a financial compliance sales within Bowney and R&L Donnelly, helping companies navigate through their IPOs and mergers and acquisitions from a regulatory standpoint. Doug also has extensive experience in the US capital markets. Doug is married with 2 children, Max and Emma, and enjoys time with all sports, especially golf and tennis. Next person as part of our presenters today is Mr. Owen West. Owen has been the Chief Procurement Officer for companies in both the mining and electricity utility industries. His senior procurement experience also includes work in government and service industries. He has managed several organizational improvement projects for procurement, IT and asset management, implementing organizations' processes, improvements and restructures. Owen also has general management experience with both large and small organizations and has international experience in Australia, Asia, UK, Ireland, Europe and the United States. He is now Managing Director of the BROWZ operations in Australia, New Zealand and Asia Pacific and manages operational staff in Sydney, Melbourne and in Perth. I now will hand you over to Doug to discuss some of the concepts around contractor pre-qualification and management. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Tino, and thank you to everyone who's taken time out of their busy days to join the webinar today. We thank you greatly for your time. Today, I wanted to try to share with you some best practices that we have learned as an organization, helping clients implement and manage contractor programs all over the globe. Contractor management continues to be a very critical part of most businesses' operations, as the partners they choose to work with can greatly affect your supply chain and have the ability to impact your overall performance as a company. There certainly are no silver bullets when it comes to contractor management. It is a lot of hard work. But we have been able to share some ideas and elements with our clients over the years, and we hope to share those with you today that hopefully lead to great outcomes when managing your supply chain. Before I get started, I'd just like to give a real brief overview on BROWZ and especially BROWZ in Australia. About 4 years ago, we started BROWZ Australia Party Limited based on the fact that one of our large North American mining clients asked us if we could help them with a regulatory challenge they were facing in Australia, actually in Western Australia. So with that, we were off and running in Australia, and it's been a great experience for us so far. Just to share with you, we continue to invest and grow the business, and currently are working with clients across many different industries, which include energy, power, mining, construction, heavy manufacturing, sports stadiums, rail and shipping, cement and aggregates, and others. So the depth and the breadth of our client base is very exciting, and I think today we have many people representing multiple industries on the call as well. So hopefully there'll be things that I share that can benefit you across industry. Just a real brief overview on BROWZ. So BROWZ has been around for 15 years. We started in the United States and in the mining space. Our very first client was Rio Tinto in Utah, of all places, because Rio had the Kennecott, Utah copper mine, which is the largest copper mine in the world. And today, Rio is still a client and has actually expanded our relationship through other parts of the world, which is, we think, a great testament to what we do and how we do it. If you were to ask what does BROWZ do, at the end of the day, BROWZ delivers assurance that your business is working with safe, qualified, and socially responsible contractors and suppliers. We do that using a methodology that's kind of tried and true, where up front we're going to work with you on strategic planning and consulting, sharing best practices, a very collaborative approach on understanding your business, and then configuring solutions which are scalable and tailored to your business needs. There's really 3 or 4 main parts to our solution, which you can see on the screen now. After we build out your program, suppliers and contractors are asked to go through an interview where they submit the qualification data that you have asked them to complete. BROWZ then validates that score using our web-based software technology and our service team that sits alongside your team to help your contractors understand your requirements and to become compliant with those and regulatory requirements over time. The end result of that is hopefully you gain compliance status with your suppliers, knowing that you're confident that they meet your needs. So the confidence in the supply chain is something that's a very virtuous thing that we focus on. What is contractor management? Well, that question can mean different things to different people, but for the purposes of our webinar today, we're going to talk about the entire life cycle of qualification, from pre-qualification through ongoing contractor management on site. And that covers the full spectrum of, obviously, cradle to grave, from when you first pre-qualify or tender work to a supplier to then the ongoing management and performance evaluation of how they're doing for you on site. Basically, who should be qualified? We would say all members of your supply chain, from contractors and vendors to suppliers as well. But for the purposes of this call today, we're going to mostly focus on those high-risk contractors who come to your site to perform a job or a service on your behalf. And this could include a myriad of job types and risks, from things like welding, high-voltage electricity, if you're in mining, working with blast explosives, or dredging, working at heights or in confined space. And so we'll share with you best practices that we've learned in working with at various risk levels that are usually present in most supply chains. The slide here that we have up today talks about you can't manage what you can't measure. So one of the things that's critical is that, information that you can collect is critical in helping you to make effective decisions on who you should be partnering with. And this slide shows that contractors over a period of time within the BROWZ system tend to see a great reduction in the amount of lost time injury rates and total recordable rates, and that has a big impact, a positive impact on your business. So we feel that data is critical to capture and to be able to use and share across your organization, and you should be able to do this in real time. The goal is a safer supply chain empowered by shared goals and values throughout your entirety of the supply chain. Obviously, safety is one of the most critical components to your business, and incidents and accidents can be quite expensive. As a matter of fact, one of our partners in the United States, the National Safety Council, ran some reports on this and have been studying the cost to businesses of various safety injuries and accidents over the past decade. And today they currently estimate that there's a direct cost of an average of $48,000 for a lost time injury that occurs on site. That would include things such as legal fees, medical bills, closing out the reports, and these types of things. But even more importantly, I think, is that there's an indirect cost of $192,000 for every lost time injury that occurs on a site. And this can include items such as loss of productivity, the retraining that must take place of replacement workers, project delays, etc. So I think we would all agree that improved safety outcomes is a key element of a successful contractor management system, and is definitely one of the things that BROWZ focuses very, very intently on. One of the things that we've learned over the years is that when contractors know they're being measured and held accountable, in other words, there's consequences to how they perform on your sites, their performance tends to improve. We have a very large company that we work with in Australia that when we started working with them and they asked us to measure their compliance against their GMRs, or global minimum requirements, they were pretty shocked to find out that only 23% of their supply chain met those GMRs at the beginning of the process. But after working with BROWZ for about 20 months, we've been able to increase that compliance rate to 87%. And to be honest, that's not an easy task. There's a lot of service and support that goes along with getting a client to the size of this one to the level of compliance that we've obtained. But we think that we can share some of those best practices with you today. One of those would be the types of information that you look to collect and how you look to qualify your key suppliers and contractors. Again, these are just some examples of the types of data that you're seeing on the screen that you may want to collect from your supply chain partners in order to help you manage risk exposure and to gain better insight into what they have in place as far as systems and procedures that can help them to perform their duties to your expectations when you engage with them. You know, one of the things that we say is if price is the same, how do you determine how you pick these contractors that you're going to work with? And these qualifications can help you determine who is best suited to meet your needs. So while this isn't a complete list, it is a good beginning of the types of data that would help you to collect about your supply chain partners. Asking for and reviewing this critical data prior to engaging with your supply chain partners will help you to reduce your risk exposure, both from a regulatory standpoint and to help you make good decisions which lead to better procurement outcomes. Owen West, who Tino introduced as well, has a lot of experience in procurement, and I was hoping, Owen, that you could just speak for a second about some of your experience around this virtuous cycle of better outcomes through consistent.
Yeah, thanks, Doug, and hi, everyone. Certainly from my experience of being CPO of a couple of large organisations, in the procurement area, we tend to have drives for procurement efficiency, but ultimately it's all about operational outcomes. We're only doing our job well in procurement if we actually improve outcomes and production or lower costs or whatever the measure is that your organisation is looking for. Procurement can be a major contributor to that, not for its own sake, but to get those operational outcomes. And in today's climate within procurement, there are so many more things to think about than certainly when I started many, many years ago. So it has become a more complex environment, and having the ability to gather the resources of your supply chain and to use your supply chain more effectively to get those better outcomes is one of the real secrets of procurement success, I think. So that would be my observation, Doug.
Thank you, Owen. That's very helpful. It's always great to hear your experience in Australia and around the world, so we appreciate those comments. Just one of the elements that was up on the pyramid that's obviously critical is insurance, managing your supplier and contractors' insurance requirements. So BROWZ helps you in this way, and we've learned many best practices around insurance, which would include understanding the risk exposure, obviously, for the type of work a certain contractor is performing on your site, and making sure that their insurance coverage is sufficient to cover your risk exposure. One of the things that we found that's really critical is to make sure, if all possible, that you became the name certificate holder on their policy. That way you're able to be notified of any changes that might happen to their policy, whether they were to change a limit or a policy were to expire. Now, the good news if you work with BROWZ is that we actually automate and track all expirations of data in a central repository. So we will collect, review, and maintain all of the insurance documents in a central repository and measure them against your own requirements to make sure the coverage is, in fact, what you demand. Safety is obviously one of the most critical areas, as I've already mentioned, in any successful contractor management program. When we talk about safety, obviously we need to understand there's two types of safety indicators. There's leading indicators and lagging indicators. Some of the leading indicators that most of our clients focus on would include things such as training, audits, behavior-based observation, and then frequent meetings internally with their EHS committees and then externally with their actual supply chain partners to make sure that they're meeting so that they can share what's required and on a consistent basis to review performance. Some of the lagging indicators that can still be quite helpful in assessing contractors, especially in a pool of how they compare against their peers, would be looking at historical safety rates such as the TRIFR and LTIFR rates, any willful citations or violations. If they've had any incidents in the last few years, you'd want to understand that. And then, of course, any fatalities. Some of our global clients have as a business rule in their program that if a contractor's had a fatality in the last 3 years, they're simply not qualified to work for them on site. These indicators, one of the nice things, as I mentioned, is that within the BROWZ system, and I'm sure other systems too that exist out there, is that you have the ability to compare how your contractors are doing versus their peer group. So if I was a client and I wanted to bring onto my site an electrical contractor, to see their data in alone wouldn't be as helpful as it would be to be able to compare that to the universe of other electrical contractors that I might have the choice to choose from. So being able to trend that data over time and then to compare contractors to their peer group is quite critical. One of the things that I think is really probably the fastest growing part of contractor management is the ability to not only qualify the contract companies that you work for to make sure that they meet your needs, but then the next level would be, do the employees of those firms also meet your needs? And the ability to effectively gather and monitor critical data on these supplier employees is truly critical, because they're the ones that are actually coming on site on behalf of the firms that you partner with to do the work on your behalf. So this is an area where BROWZ, has really seen an uptake in this part of the offering that we have. Not many other companies do have this offering, but we're helping clients manage the contractor employees around things such as training, licenses, certifications. When they come to the site, do they have the right safe work method statements, risk assessments, JSAs, et cetera, in place? And this can greatly help reduce your risk exposure. But I think one of the most critical best practices that we found around this is how this can help companies to push their own values down into the supply chain. So this gives you an opportunity through training and through other forms of communication to be able to share with those employees how you expect them to work on site, maybe to have them agree to sign off on a code of ethics before they work on your site, to be aware of all the safety issues that might exist on a certain site. It's really an opportunity for you as a client, like I said, to push those values down into the supply chain and to make sure that, in essence, that your supply chain partners' employees are being treated and acting very similar to your own employees. The next area I just wanted to speak on just briefly is financial pre-qualification. Again, another very fast-growing part of the industry. I think it's critical if you're going to hire a partner to come on and do a type of work for you, prior to awarding that work, I would say it's pretty critical to know if the supplier that you're going to be awarding the work to, if you've checked to make sure that you feel confident they're going to be around tomorrow to actually perform the work. And have they had experience in doing this type of work before? And probably more importantly, do they currently have the necessary people and equipment in place today to be able to handle the type of project that you're looking to give them? So all those types of things lead to the ability to look into their financial stability, to check to make sure that they don't have any recent bankruptcies or judgments, and to basically check on reports that would signal that they're in strong financial standing before you do, in fact, go ahead and award them some work. In Australia, BROWZ is integrated with VITA, which is also known as Corporate Express, for our clients to have a view of their supply chain's overall financial health. There's actually 3 levels of reports available for you to choose from and for you to reference. And one of the nice things is all those documents are able to be uploaded directly into BROWZ, and all the reports are stored right in a central location for you to be able to access at your convenience. Another part of the pyramid that I showed earlier that's, I think, really becoming critical, especially from a risk standpoint, is corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility is an area of intense scrutiny from a regulatory standpoint that can, very quickly affect your reputation and affect your brand image and lead to severe fines and penalties if not effectively managed. BROWZ is a member of the UN Global Compact, which is putting in place regulatory frameworks around many of these areas. These areas would include things that you should be aware of how your supply chain partners are handling them, such as voluntary employment, child labor, freedom of association, anti-corruption, anti-bribery, sustainability, and remuneration. Once again, Owen, I think with all your global experience, it might be helpful if you could add a comment or two to this area.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Look, it's probably fair to say that some of the CSR issues are probably not as prominent in Australia as they are overseas, but it's certainly a very, very emerging trend. And if people or companies don't get ahead of the curve, then they will be found out. I know from when I worked in the UK, there were some very, very public examples where products that were manufactured in sort of lesser developed countries and may have used child labour or other less attractive ways of manufacturing. Often the way they get found out, of course, is through social media. So in today's world of everyone's got a camera, everyone tweets, if companies don't adopt a very robust CSR policy and program, it won't be long before they do get caught out. So while I started off saying it's perhaps not as prominent in Australia as overseas, it certainly will be very soon. So if companies don't have CSR monitoring programs with their suppliers, they certainly will need to have them.
Thank you, Owen. The next slide here speaks to supply chain risk and how obviously you engage all types of different contractors, and each of those is actively performing different tasks on site for you. The reality is some are performing very high-risk tasks. Could be things such as working, again, with explosives or working with high-voltage electricity or working in confined space, working at heights, many other things that we could point to. But others might be just coming on site to mow the lawn or maybe fix a printer. And so what BROWZ realized in working with clients all over the world is that these different risk levels should not be basically being put through the same level of assessment. So a higher risk contractor should be put through a much more thorough and deeper level of assessment than someone that poses a much lower risk, like I said, someone who's maybe coming on site to fix a printer. The idea then is that BROWZ allows clients to set these levels of assessment and the elements that are contained within each based on risk. And that could include things like the insurance limits that would be required, doing audits of the high-risk contractors' health and safety programs, doing a deeper dive into JSAs and things like that. So this is an area that I think being able to segment supply chain by risk which is something that we would share as a best practice. And whether you do this internally or use a third party such as BROWZ, this is pretty intuitive to me, but a lot of folks just need help with what areas of assessment should take place in each of those different risk categories. Like I mentioned before, probably one of the leading indicators that you have complete control of as a client is the type of induction training and training in general that you require your supply chain partners to go through before they come on site and begin to work with you. I think that what we do at BROWZ is we help to deliver our clients web-based induction training. So we have a system that can take your training and we can induct your suppliers and contractors before they come on site. So by the time they get there, they're ready to perform the work for which you've engaged them. But when they show up on site, I think however you do this, it's critical that things such as emergency evacuations and protocols should be clearly understood. This is a chance for you to also, again, push your values around safety down into the supply chain. Through training, acknowledgement of your critical risk areas, and agreeing to your code of ethics on how to work on site. This is a great area for you to limit your risk exposure. One of the biggest changes that I've seen in this industry over the last decade is that many years ago, if a contractor was involved in an incident or an accident on site, that liability pretty much stayed with them. What's changed from a regulatory standpoint especially in the last 5 years, is that across the globe, regulators in these various industries have made it pretty clear that they view contract employees on site almost as your employees. So where in the past you could say it wasn't us, it was them, regulators now push back with a mindset of they is now you. So when it comes to a legal framework around incidents and injuries, this is a key area of control that you guys have power over. So I guess there's lots of different things that you can insist of as far as training, but making sure that when people show up on site, they really understand your values, what's expected, what any risks are at the site, how to evacuate a site, and basically the code of ethics that you demand from them. Those are areas that I would pay very close attention to before hiring and bringing someone onto a site from an employee standpoint. And it kind of plays into the next slide, which is a best practice that I think that we would share with almost all our clients around the globe. And many people struggle with this, to be fair, is that having a consistent approach across business units, across sites, across regions, across countries, across risk levels can be very challenging. But from a regulatory standpoint, I think it's critical that you do have this consistent approach throughout your organization, which would mean, having the same methodologies of how you go about qualifying the partners that you're going to use with. A single qualification event per year, allowing for different requirements based on the job that they'll be performing, can be a fine achievement. Actually, it could be a great way of building a better relationship with your supply chain partners, because one of the things that we've heard is that a very high source of irritation for the suppliers and contractors that work with our clients is when they constantly have to go through a different approach or different methodology, different process whenever they're asked to come onto a different site to do work for a client. So having that same approach, that consistent methodology, can be a very virtuous cycle of actually improving the relationship between you and your supply chain partners. Now, again, from a regulatory standpoint, it also helps you to greatly reduce your risk exposure, because if a contractor was to have an accident or injury while working on one of your sites, one of the first things that regulators try to get to is what process did you use to qualify these folks before you brought them on site. And if they find out that you had a different process at one site that you weren't employing at a different site, that can lead to all kinds of problems. So I guess the best practice around this would be making sure, wherever possible, that you have a consistent approach and that that's shared across your organization. So the critical component of that, obviously, then is communication. And what we found is that you can have the best software, the best people in place, but if the program is not shared effectively both internally and externally to those different stakeholders, chances are the plan's probably not going to be successful. So one of the most critical pieces to any successful program is to over-communicate really both to your internal and external stakeholders. We can't emphasize this enough, that everyone involved must understand the program objectives, requirements, measurements, what they need to do to become compliant, and how the program is going to be enforced. A program that is not well communicated will fail and will lead to frustration of all involved. There's many different ways that you can communicate what's expected of your supply chain, in order to communicate this effectively. It can be done through written materials, online webinars such as what we're having today, phone calls. But, at the end of the day, this is usually some type of change management exercise that's really intended to make everyone's life easier, but it can backfire if it's not well communicated. Another key learning that we'd want to share with you is that, enforcement of a program is critical. A program that lacks enforcement against the requirements that you've put in place really is worthless. So the internal stakeholders must follow the processes and procedures for engagement. Just as importantly as the external stakeholders, your partners must also follow those same requirements. What we found is that contractors, when these plans are put into place or there's any type of communication involved, the first thing that they tend to do is reach out to their local internal contact at your company and ask, what does it mean to me, what's expected of me, and what do I need to do to become compliant? And that's why it's so critical that not only themselves understand, but also your internal stakeholders must be fully informed of the program and what it is that they need to convey to their external stakeholders and their partners. With that said, I think that there's a lot of things that can come from this that will really help you as a business. We talk to this as kind of like the carrot and the stick, the idea that your contractors that are meeting your requirements and that are investing in the programs that you're asking them to invest in, over time should probably get more work than folks that are not doing those types of things. So, it speaks to, over time, growing the relationship with your best suppliers, and the ones that invest typically should get more work. Oh, and I'd ask you, seeing how you've been on both sides of this fence, to speak to your ideas around procurement and how this can work in a virtuous cycle.
Thanks, Doug. I think, what you said about communication is absolutely right. If the organisation doesn't understand what this is about, then you'll get contractors ringing their mates saying, you've employed me many times before. How come I've suddenly got to go through all these requirements and meet these standards? But the reality is that any contractor does have to meet those standards, and companies who don't put contractors through that process are remiss and are at risk. So that the contractors may believe that they're complying with your standards at the moment, but if you're not laying out those standards rigorously enough in a way that they can understand, then they may not be. And we're not trying to be disciplinarians here, or we're not trying to be negative about contractors, but they do have to meet requirements and do have to meet those standards. And if they don't, then they won't be in business for long, because these are just standard requirements these days in this increasingly regulated environments that we're in. So these have become common processes now that you have supplier pre-qualification systems. All suppliers go through it. You deal with contractors who are compliant. Your risk is protected. The contractors are actually protected as well. We certainly have a lot of feedback from contractors that they appreciate going through this process. They appreciate understanding what the requirements are. They appreciate being on a level playing field. And for them, they get almost an independent review of their organisation and whether they meet standards. So it's actually can be quite a win-win for the contractors as well. Thanks, Doug.
No, thanks, Owen. I think that's really helpful and some great insight there. one of the things that we find is that contractor management is one of those things that cuts across an entire organization. All these people sitting at this table whose chairs represent these different departments are involved in some way, shape, or form at some time with your supply chain. And all these people need to be kept in the loop around processes, policies, and performance of your supply chain partners. So obviously you can tell by their titles that they all have slightly different focuses, but yet the common goal is to have great safety performance, zero harm, and to make sure that your contractors are working in a way that represent your firm in the marketplace in a way that keeps you out of harm from risk exposure and basically shares your goals and values about how to work in your local places of business. One of the things that we've learned is that it's so critical that key information around contractor management is not siloed, but can easily be shared across the organization. As an example, if safety isn't speaking with procurement, then sometimes contractors that you otherwise might not engage with can be engaged, and that can expose you to more risk. One of the examples I share with clients is about a client that we met with very early on in Australia where the CEO came down to understand a little bit more about how we could help their business. And he gave us an example that, that I share that really resonates with people, and maybe it will with some on the phone. But one of the challenges that can happen is that different departments, when they don't know what other departments are doing around contractor management, definitely can increase the risk exposure. So the example that he shared was that his business was actually in litigation with one of their key suppliers in one division, while in another division they were actually giving them a very large contract and completely unaware of this conflict. So, again, Owen, I would just ask you, with all your local knowledge, if you had any other insights that you could share around how important it is to share data across the organization.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I certainly remember examples sort of in my procurement days where, procurement has a real facilitator role to play here. I know certainly one of the things I really, really enjoyed about working in procurement is that you have insights both internally and externally across the organisation. So you're well aware of all the operational issues that are going on, and you're well aware of external markets and environments. And procurement can be one of the melting points, if you like, of where this information comes together and that information can be shared. And again, I think, supply pre-qualification systems are tools that procurement can use to facilitate that across organisations. Actually, Doug, I think another one, I think you mentioned where you'd had, a litigation example. Another really good example is where a contractor may perform either very well or not so well on a particular project. So if each project can share information about a contractor's performance, that can be a really, really useful and valuable tool across the whole organisation. So, for example, a supplier pre-qualification system is not just about some raw data before you engage a contractor. There should also be a performance monitoring module at the end. And BROWZ is a very neat one in that it's a very black and white assessment. Did they perform well? Did they meet budget? Did they finish on time? And you upload documents which might describe their performance, and that can then be shared across the organisation. So again, if they're a bad performer in one area, that may or may not be relevant as to whether they'll be a bad performer in another area. So yeah, certainly can't emphasise enough that shared data role, both for safety and procurement, is really, really important.
Thanks, Owen, and thanks for those other examples. I think that's really helpful. It does play into the next slide, to reduce your risk exposure. Obviously, that's one of the stated goals when we work with our clients is to help them reduce the risk exposure. Obviously, risk is closely aligned with reputation, and never more so than today, like Owen mentioned before, with the advent of social media. Any risk issues can impact your brand equity and also your social license to operate. And it's one of those things that it's much better to get out in front of early than late. And I think Owen spoke to some of these instances in the UK and in Europe previously. But Owen, if you wanted to add any other thoughts around, I know risk an area that you take a great interest in. So, just obviously contractors do introduce risk to an organization. Anytime you bring someone on site to do some work for you, you're exposing your organization to the risk of how they perform. So any other thoughts that you might have, Ron?
No, they absolutely do, because, generally most organisations might have, a significant slice of their operating cost might be internal labour, but a lot of that's also supporting labour. Most organisations will have a very significant cost element where they've outsourced and are using contractors who come on site. And I remember one of the guys who used to work for me not that many years ago saying all of our problems come from contractors, because when you bring them on site, you've not only got to go through all of their basic attributes like have they got the right insurance policies, but have their staff been trained? Are their staff aware of your standards around behaviours? Not just safety behaviours like in wearing the right equipment, but behaviours in terms of how you project to the community. And that was certainly a big issue where I worked in government construction projects, where a really important element of that is how do these contractors behave, and because they're visible, they are your face to the community and to other industries. So it is certainly more than just, have they got the right insurance policies which aren't expired, but have their staff been trained in, to your standards, and you can set those training standards, you can set those training materials. And if they haven't been trained, if they haven't got an up-to-date training certificate, then don't let them on site. And that can all be managed through that pre-qualification system. Thanks, Dave.
Great stuff. Thanks, Owen. I think you stole a little bit of my thunder on this next slide, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one. But, evaluating the performance of the contractors and sharing that across the organization is critical. Obviously, from a procurement standpoint, they need to know, how did people perform from a safety standpoint when they were working on site? How did they perform against timelines, deadlines? How did they perform against financial budgets? So, do you track that and do you close those loops so that information is shared, not only within your organization, but also do you share that feedback with the contractors? And basically, some companies too, and I think, Owen, you shared this once with me, and I thought it was very interesting that when you worked at a company, you actually had the contractors rate you for how you do as a company versus what they expected when they engaged with you. So that 360-degree process is something that can be quite valuable, quite a shared learning experience as well.
It can be confronting, Doug, but it's a great opportunity for internal improvements to understand how well your specifications are written. How well does your supervision work on a site? And, how do we handle tender submissions? Are we timely? These are really, really useful bits of feedback to get.
Absolutely. Thanks, Owen, for that great feedback. So I guess, we're getting ready to close here. I guess hopefully you've gotten some good takeaways. One of the things I'll share, this is the last real slide, is that, some of the best companies that we work with are always looking for ways to improve their programs, and they really view that information is critical. The old saying, knowledge is power. So they're constantly looking for ways to implement solutions and resolutions based on the data that they've collected and the results of that data. And then they're striving for active engagement with their critical contractors, so they want to meet with them frequently. They want to share feedback. They want to share feedback around things like incidents or almost near incidents, reporting, reviews and action plans, setting common goals and ideas around how they can jointly improve this entire process to everyone's benefit. And as we look ahead, one of the things that BROWZ is excited about is that technology is allowing us to do new things to help make our clients' lives easier and their employees' lives easier. some of those things would include mobile. So with the advent of mobile technology, BROWZ is allowing our clients to do their jobs from anywhere, as if like never before, where in the past they had to be at a desk to access the critical data that gave them the information they needed to make real-time decisions. Now you can do that from the place of work, right on site, interfacing directly with your contractors, doing spot checks on their licenses or certifications, doing audits on site. Another thing that we're really getting into is site management around things like time and attendance, who's on site, when did they come on, how long have they been on site, and that can really help our clients to resolve billing disputes or rectify and reconcile invoicing that they're getting from their contractors. So there's lots of exciting stuff that's on the horizon, and we think that this is a great industry in helping our clients to manage a critical part of their business. And our hope today is that we've given you some thoughts and some things to think about in your business. And with that, I guess I'll turn it back over to Tino, and we'll invite you to ask any questions that you might have. And I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Doug and Owen. At this point, we would like to turn over to some questions that we have received. Just from an audience perspective, if you look in your right-hand corner of your screen, there should be a Q&A button, and that's how you can send in any questions that you have and that you want to ask the presenters. Just in terms of questions that we already have received, Doug, maybe I'll ask you this one. How does BROWZ help communicate requirements to the internal and external stakeholders?
Yeah, that's a great question. So part of the BROWZ offering is that we have a full service offering that supports both our clients and also their supply chain partners. So once we've worked with our clients to establish what the requirements are going to be for their program, we share those requirements with people, calling the contractors in person and also through written materials. The process is ongoing. It's not a one-time process, and it's a very proactive process. Whereas some software companies have like a reactive service model, BROWZ has a very proactive service model where we engage with the contractors up front starting day one to get them loaded into the system, to help them answer the questions required, again, to share the requirements and what they needed to do in order to become compliant, and then on an ongoing basis to work with them, to fix any deficiencies they might have that's keeping them from becoming compliant. And, we're proud that in Australia, all our customer service people work locally in Australia, whether it's in Sydney or Perth or in Melbourne, and so all support is local. And we think it's a big differentiator. It helps our clients to reduce their administrative burden around doing things like collecting insurance documents or reviewing safety policies, things like this. So the service aspect we think is critical, and again, we believe in over-communicating rather than under-communicating, and our supply chain specialists work directly with your suppliers to help them with all aspects of the program. So that's a great question.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. We've received another question. Maybe, Owen, if you can answer this question first. How do you overcome the issue of contractors not wanting to participate in the program or submit any information, data into the system?
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Tina. And look, that's another good question because, look, the reality is that there will be contractors who may not want to participate in the system. You've got, I think I might have mentioned before, contractors who've been working with you for years may wonder about the sudden need to provide all these requirements and to meet all these standards. But the reality is if they can't do that, then they're not really going to be very effective in their own business. Or if they've got an existing relationship, they may want to keep that relationship. But what these systems do actually is provide a level playing field for contractors, and if the relationship can't stand up to scrutiny and be judged very fairly as to their true capabilities and certificates and so on, then that's a good relationship that deserves investigation. But I think I said before too, most contractors do see the benefits of it, and we unashamedly talk to contractors about the benefits that they get out of the system. In that, they appreciate that, for the first time, maybe they really understand the true nature of what the generic requirements are for some of these construction projects, and what it allows the procurement and the project people to do. It removes the need for the continual uploading or the continual asking of the same generic questions. And contractors make a business of responding to tenders in that way, but it puts it all into a common computer platform, and the information's always there. So when you go to tender in future, you can really focus on what are the site-specific issues where we do want to really discriminate between contractors on who is going to deliver the best outcome for this project in this place at that time. And you can really focus on those issues in your tender evaluations and not spend a lot of unnecessary and inefficient time, going through insurances and so on. And often when we go through insurances, we make sure they're all right at the time of awarding a contract, but, in 6 or 12 months' time, we're never quite sure that they're still all in place as they should be, which these systems can give you some comfort about. Okay, thanks, Dina.
Thank you, Owen. We've received another question, maybe to both the presenters, Owen and Doug. Maybe if any one of you want to answer this one. What are some of the leading indicators that you'd recommend to track one contractors? I would assume, leading indicators that you recommend to track the contractors.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. I think we touched on it a little bit on the safety slide, but there's leading and lagging indicators around safety, and some of the leading indicators, obviously training would be one that we focused a lot on. That would be one of the main ones. A lot of this will come back to the company, the client themselves, their employees, doing things like behavior-based observation, so watching for safe or unsafe behaviors and pointing those out, sharing that information with the critical players that might be involved. Near-miss incidents, of course, tracking those, what happened, what could we have done better. Auditing, I think, is a big one. So being able to audit prior to engaging with people, what types of programs do they have, and then are those in line with what you expect them to have? So those would be some of the main ones that I would point to, along with just continually meeting with your supply chain partners to share best practices and what you expect when they come on site. Oh, and I don't know if you have any others that you'd like to share.
Yeah, it's an interesting one actually, because it's often difficult to look at a contract. You look at past performance, whether it's their safety stats or even their past project performance, and it can be difficult to judge whether you'll get those same outcomes on your project. A lot depends on the people on any project. You don't want to end up with the B team. You do want to end up with the A team. So I think, Doug, you mentioned training. I think that's a really critical one. That do they have processes in place? And more importantly, is it more than just a certificate on the wall? They might have a quality process that says they trained their staff, but when you go in and do an audit, and actually staff training is a really good audit example, because you go in and say, well, give me a list of your employees, and here I'm picking half a dozen names at random. Show me the actual training records of these people. And that's a really good way of making sure that whichever staff team you get on your project, that they have been through the right processes, and therefore their performance is likely to be good for you, or as good or better than what it has been in the past. Thanks.
Thank you, Owen. I think we've probably got time for a last question. What are some of the downsides of running this internally? Benefits of running it externally? So maybe Doug, if you can give us any comment on that question.
Well, that's an interesting one. It really depends on the client, to be honest. I mean, we've had big clients, big global Fortune 100 companies that have had lots of internal resources that have still chosen to outsource this to BROWZ. I think if you said what's the main benefit of that, it's the reduction in administrative burden. It's having a third party that has a lot of experiences to share best practices with how other global clients maybe have dealt with similar challenges that particular company might be facing. The service aspect that I spoke to of being able to communicate through a third party, what's expected. Again, just freeing up their own employees to maybe focus on things like performance and contractor management from a more holistic standpoint, rather than tracking down insurance documents or safety documents, things like that. So I think that's definitely a main reason. I think also, like Owen mentioned, just having the web-based technology that, in BROWZ's case, is configurable to our clients' specific needs, and then having that central repository where you can store and access all that data. I guess one of the things that I've heard quite a bit in Australia is, especially in the mining space or other similar spaces, where regulators can pop up kind of unexpectedly and ask for documents, and sometimes it can take a long time for people to find documents in file folders or what have you. Whereas if you had it in a central repository, and it's impressive to the regulators too, to be able to see that information very neatly packaged. So I guess, and then the other question, I guess, was what's the benefits to doing it internally? Well, I guess if you have a great program, you have a great software, and you're able to manage this, that you get to totally control every aspect of it. There's nothing wrong with that. We find a lot of people, like any outsourced decision, they weigh these things closely, and certainly, the things I touched on already would be the main reason why people would choose to use someone like BROWZ.
Actually, so Doug and Tina, can I just quickly take a few moments? I can think of a really embarrassing example for me here. A few years ago, I got a consultant to go through the data that we held in our SAP system on suppliers, and we were pretty confident that we'd entered all the data and it was all good. And but we found what they told us was that 80% of our supply chain had incorrect data. Now, it wasn't that 80% of the data was wrong, but 80% of the suppliers had at least one element. A person may have left, phone numbers were wrong, the address had changed, and this was pretty basic information in SAP. It didn't include all of the sort of attributes and capabilities around contractors, such as certificates and licenses and insurances or so on. So it was a really hard lesson for me to learn that, with the best will in the world to do it internally, it's very expensive, it's very time-consuming, and the bottom line is it just doesn't get done as well as it should. Whereas if you've got a 24/7 system where the supplier can update their information at any time, and they do get chased by third parties to make sure that data is up to date, it's certainly in a much, much better position to be in. And that's one of the reasons why we went with one of those systems, because we just had a hard lesson that our internal processes were not as good as we thought they were, and not good enough.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you, Doug. I think this concludes our presentation for today. Please feel free to contact any of the presenters if you have any further questions. Thank you for attending the webinar. Goodbye.